In 1896, Georges Méliès, the so-called French master of illusion, created a film titled The Devil's Castle, also known as The Haunted Castle in the United States. The short 3-minute film opens up with a bat circling around a creepy room in a castle. It is in this silent film that we're greeted with a skeleton and then the devil himself. These simple haunting figures would later appear in an outstanding amount of times in the future history of the genre. The genre, of course, being horror. What I just showed you is widely considered as the first horror movie, a genre that shifts into a new era with each decade. It has formed into many subgenres within itself. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, horror films were inspired by Gothic horror, a genre told in many novels throughout the second millennium by famous authors such as Robert Stevenson, Mary Shelley, and the American legend himself, Edgar Allan Poe. These Gothic stories explored haunted castles with classic creepy fall scenery that translated into the early horror classics. Crossing over into the early 1910s silent era, the original Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and werewolf films were released. These classics would eventually be remade again in the future decades. Horror films were very well defined all across Europe, as seen in Dante's Inferno from Italy, exploring hell, purgatory, and heaven itself. However, in 1914, something even more terrifying affected Europe, and that was the outbreak of the First Great War. Following the epidemic and loss of 14 million lives, troops across the earth came back to their home countries after experiencing true horror and death. Filmmakers wanted to get away, and citizens in Germany needed to get away desperately due to an embarrassing loss to the Triple Entente in 1918. German films were based off of the supernatural. The 1920s turned to be Germany's era of expressionism, that was a type of cinema of intense symbolism and stylized sets. In the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, shadows were painted on sets and had unorthodox perspective shots. This type of filmmaking led to an inspired piece known as Nosferatu, said by journalists at the time to be a genuinely frightening film to cause nightmares. There's a reason why it's called German Expressionism. Following World War I, Germany was isolated as a country from the rest of the globe. They were in debt to countries, and the fragile Weimar Republic was about to fall apart. The war operations of the Treaty of Versailles led to high inflation across the country, and one of the only places of market success was in film. In 1925, the future vice president known as Charles Dawes offered a plan to Germany to try and stabilize the country's economy via loans and other agreements. Via the plan, however, the amount of German film exports decreased, leading to a crippling economy for films in Germany. Companies known as MGM and Paramount came in to rescue the failing companies by lending them money, in return for collaboration rights of German directors and writers. Germans migrated to Hollywood in the mid-1920s for work in studios, and even well into the early 1930s, but some would say that was for another reason. Also in the decade of the 20s, another soon-to-be giant would step in to produce films of horror. Their films would be based off of human deformities. This would lead to The Hunchback of Notre Dame and The Phantom of the Opera, two silent films that had a key star known as Lon Chaney, the man of 1,000 faces. A man who had his own type of casting magic, who didn't have dialogue, but just used his facial expressions for a horrifying performance. Chaney would die in 1930, just as the Universal Monster series was about to start. The next decade would lead to another seismic shift within the horror genre.